Welcome back to another edition of TOCA Backstage. This is Chris Wolf, the Executive Director of Torrance Cultural Arts Foundation. I am very honored to have the director of the upcoming production, One Small Step, Mr. Toby Hulse, who actually, I believe we're talking you're all the way in London?
Bristol.
Bristol. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I certainly do appreciate it. For those who may not have a season brochure in front of them and may not be really familiar with the show, can you sort of capsulize what the show is?
Of course, yeah. It's the history of the space race, and we start with the launch of Sputnik 1, and we end with Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. And it deals with both the Soviet and the American space programs. And it's told entirely by two actors and what looks like an attic full of junk. So the two actors together create all the characters, the astronauts and cosmonauts, the politicians, the driving forces behind the space race. They recreate all the most iconic moments of that 12-year period of history. Yeah, it's an hour and a half of history, science, and just basic nonsense, really.
And so, am I correct in assuming? I mean, I've done a little research on you, as I said earlier. You have a tremendous history of not only directing, which I believe you directed this show, but you also are a writer. Did you also write this show?
I didn't write this show. We were given a script by a writer called David Hastings, which he prepared for a TV documentary. It was about 60 pages long, which is far too long for a 1 hour show. But what he'd done is all the research. In fact, all the people who worked on the show are space geeks, if it's okay to use that word. But he's a real enthusiast about space, and he had selected from that enormous amount of documentary material. He'd selected the key moments. He'd found all the key speeches, the interviews, the bits of scientific description that we needed, and then from that incredibly valuable document and all his research material, there was so much research material that it kind of reached up as high as one of the actors when it was all stacked up in box files. From that material, we devised the show using his words, but also a lot of what's spoken is equivalent to found material or verbatim material. I suppose I crafted it from the existing material. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the two actors are portraying kids on stage?
No, they have a childlike enthusiasm, but they're not actually playing children. There's a lovely quotation which we ended up not using in the show about Walter Cronkite when he reflects back on the Apollo 11 landing. He says the last thing we expected to see were two adults who looked like children playing in the. And when you look at Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin bounding around, they look like children playing. So the show has a very childlike, playful approach, but the actors themselves are playing adults. But the way that in the same way when children want to explain something, they'll pick up a stick and it can become a rocket, and they can pick up a donut and it can become a space station or whatever. So it's got that feel to it,
right?
And all of the spacecraft and technology that we recreate are done using household objects or bits and pieces of junk or just anything that we found lying around to tell that story. So it's got that feeling of play is infused all the way through it. Yes.
And was this show created specifically for the anniversary of?
No, actually, we created the show 11 years ago was its first outing, and David Hastings was working as the stage doorkeeper at Oxford Playhouse, which was the theatre that originated the show at the time, and he'd just done an MA in creative writing, and the script was part of his MA. And he sent it to the theatre and said, would you like to put this on? I'm your stage doorkeeper. And they approached me knowing that I would take a playful approach to the script as it was very science heavy, the one that he'd written. And that show then we launched it in Oxford. We took it to the Edinburgh Fringe, where it did very well. It then toured for a year in the UK and then went back to the Edinburgh Fringe, and it got picked up by the British Council. And we then did a year and a half's tour where we went to British Council territories. So we went all through the Middle East, all through the Arab Spring. We went to lots of the former Soviet Union countries. We went to the States. We went to India, Sri Lanka. I mean, the tour grew and grew and grew. And there was something about, it surprised us, but there was something about the story which had a universality that we didn't expect, and something about the way that we were telling it that made it very, very attractive to countries all across the world, particularly ones where we didn't expect there to be an interest in what's essentially a story of an American achievement. But it was really, and I think it's because the story is about how if human beings work together, and if they have imagination and they have drive and they have the will to succeed, they can overcome impossible odds. I think that's right at the heart of the space race. That's the story. So it then went to bed up for some years, and then with the anniversary of Apollo 11 coming up, we revived it last year so that we could tour it this year to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landing.
Amazing. So do you find that this show is I mean, it's part of our family series, but how young do you think kids, will it get lost on kids too young?
No, not at all. I mean, our favourite audience is, I saw an excellent example of this in Oxford, where we had a grandparent, a parent and a child, and the child would have been about 5, and the grandparent leant to the parent and said, do you remember when I took you out into the garden when you were about 5, and I pointed at the moon and I said, there are people walking on the moon right now? And the parent turned to the child and said, yes, that's true. It happened when I was your age. And actually, it's a multi-generational show. So whilst there are things in there which will be personal memories for people who lived through that period of history, there's also a whole new world to be discovered for people who weren't alive in that period of the 60s and 50s. And the way that we present it makes it very suitable for children as young as 5. And what we also found when we toured with British Council, for non-English speakers as well, it's a very visual show, and everything. One of our rules in rehearsal was, if you can show it, then don't say it. So there are whole sequences which of spaceships docking or satellites being launched, which are all told with these household objects with very little words at all. It's all it's done visually and with sound effects and
can I just say that what you were saying during rehearsal is something that so many more shows need to say. It's like, if you can show it, don't say it, because it drives me nuts. So tell me about yourself. How did you? What was your career trajectory to become a well-known director, playwright? Did you start off wanting to do that?
I suppose I'd always been doing it, but not realised that I had, and I think that's quite often the case with people. So as a child, I spent a lot of time with toys, making up stories with my toys, and I also tried writing plays quite young, quite an early age. My first play was I wrote for my Cub Scout troop. I must have been about 8 or 9, I think, and it was the story of Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake, but I got the two of them mixed up. So it was the story of this sea captain who went across to America, discovered potatoes and tobacco, came back, defeated the Spanish Armada, and then put a cloak underneath the feet of Queen Elizabeth I. So no regard for history whatsoever. But I got all the key things. And I was lucky that my father worked in the theatre. He was an arts administrator, so we spent a lot of time as children hanging around theatres, not backstage, but in the offices. So all our scrap paper when we were little was the backs of posters and box office return sheets, and So theatres were very familiar to me. But it took me a long time to work out how to make that interest work as a career, actually. And I did theatre at university. I put on plays at university. I would take shows up to the Edinburgh Fringe. And then I also worked as a teacher. I was in Britain it's called early years, so I was teaching nursery and reception, so 3, 4, 5-year-old children, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I really enjoyed, and that's all about play again. And I live in Bristol, and we've got a theatre school here, the Bristol Vic Theatre School, and I decided just to try retraining, and I went and did a director's course for a year, and actually found that I was really interested in children's theatre, really interested in family theatre, and in particular in that multi-generational theatre that crosses, you know, all ages. And it's a very difficult thing to create, but perhaps that theatre that a 5-year-old and a 75-year-old can watch together and enjoy for the same reasons, not because there's jokes for adults and jokes for children, but because they're all enjoying the same thing. On leaving the theatre school, I met the woman who ran the education department at Bristol Vic, which is the main producing house in Bristol, and they were touring a show to schools, and they needed someone who could not only appear in the shows but could run workshops with teachers alongside it. And because I'd had my teaching experience, I was able to do that, and it grew from there, really. And I've had a number of lucky breaks where people would say to me, "You couldn't write a show for 3-year-olds, can you?" And I go, "Yeah." And that's the rule, isn't it? You always say yes and then work out if you can afterwards. Yeah, so I've been working professionally now for 20 years, and most of my work is in family theatre. I do a lot of adaptation as well. I'm very interested in adaptation, and how you take stories that exist in one medium and make them work on stage, or have a kind of conversation with that work on stage. And I've continued working in schools. I do a lot of work in schools with young people. I'm currently teaching teenagers a kind of basic stagecraft course. Yeah, so it's a variety, as a mix of theatre and education and family work, and all of those put together means you can pay the rent. that's the hardest thing in the arts, isn't it?
So part of what our foundation does is we not only present a season of shows, but we want to help nurture and mentor, you know, young artists and give them sort of a stepping stone, or at least help them find their way. As a professional in the theater, what words of wisdom do you impart onto young kids who are wanting to pursue it?
I would say one of the things that I'm teaching the teenagers at the moment that I'm working with is have the confidence to fail, and have the confidence to try something, not knowing whether it'll succeed or not. The confidence to laugh at one's own failures, but also the confidence to step back from things that haven't quite worked, and instead of just rejecting them, start to ask the questions as to why those things might not have worked. But then alongside that, being just as critical of things that are successful. I find that one of the most difficult things, when something goes really well, it's really tempting to walk away from it and go, well, that went really well, and leave it at that. But it's actually at those moments when you should be sitting and analysing why something has gone well. It's very much easier when something goes wrong to walk away and start to analyse it. And then you start to come up with rules that are based on negatives rather than rules that are based on positives. I had a really interesting experience when I was at university, which actually taught me an enormous amount about how to make theatre work. I did an adaptation of Gogol's short story The Nose, which is a favourite. I studied Russian at school, and it's one of my favourite short stories. And at the time, I was very into the work of Stephen Berkoff. and I'd seen a lot of Stephen Berkoff's work, and like most 20-year-olds, all I was doing was imitating what I'd seen. And I produced what I thought was a kind of hardcore physical theatre, Stephen Berkoff style social, you know, audiences were going to come out terrified by what they'd seen. And we did the first performance, and the audiences roared with laughter all the way through. It was a real shock to us. And myself and the cast stepped away from it and went, okay, so the audience really enjoyed that, but not for the reasons that we thought. But it's clearly a success, but we don't know why it's a success. So we sat that evening and we analysed what we'd done, and went back and put the show on again the next day. And again, we got a lot of laughter out of it. And then we realised that what we'd invented was some kind of comedy. We didn't know that we'd invented that. And about 2 weeks into, and the great thing about Edinburgh is you get these 4-week runs. So about 2 weeks into the run, someone came to see it, and they came up to us afterwards and they said, you've all trained with Philippe Gaulier, haven't you? You're all clowns. And that was the first I'd heard of clowning, the first I'd heard of Philippe Gaulier and the idea of theatre clown. And we'd invented it by mistake. And it was a really salutary moment of, look at your mistake, look at the things that are going wrong, but look at the successes and analyze them and learn from them, and keep going, keep like being prepared to make the same thing over and over again, just to see what will work. And I think that's what I learned from that. In Britain, we have a company called Knee High, who tour internationally, and one of their rehearsal principles is strong but wrong. So make an offer, make sure it's strong. Doesn't matter if it's wrong, as long as you've committed to that offer, you've committed to that decision. You can't really be criticised for it. And I think that's a very hard thing for young people to do, because there's a fear of being judged, and education systems want us to be right, and we'd have to learn to kind of unpick that a bit, and be prepared to be wrong, and be prepared to make a fool of ourselves a bit. And out of that, we can discover the things that will take us forward as artists.
That what you were saying about the clowning really was intriguing. So you created the show that you accidentally created a clowning show?
Yes.
But is that what sort of led you to now? Because I noticed in your this thing that I read about you, that clowning was one of the things that you were active in. Was that sort of why you got interested in clowning, or did it?
Yeah. It was someone pointing that out to me, and then the more clowning that I watched, and the more work that I did in those areas, and the more books that I read, and the more people that I spoke to, I realised that actually the sort of theatre that I liked, and the ways of telling stories that I liked, and that playfulness, and that ability to laugh at oneself, but also the vulnerability of putting yourself on stage, those were all things that appealed to me, and they were all things that I already felt. When I teach I now teach at Bristol Vic Theatre School, and I teach improvisation and clowning and performing for younger audiences. And one of the things that I was say to the theatre school is, you probably know the answers already about what you think theatre is, or what you think acting is. What you should be looking for is the people who think the same as you, and that kind of confirmation of. So for some people, they'll read Stanislavski and go, yeah, that makes sense to me. I understand that. And some people will come across the work of Meisner and will say, well, that makes sense to me. It so happened that I came across the work of the great clowns, and that made sense. That made sense to me. So, if we're going to put on a show about the space race, then it makes sense to me that obviously the rocket will be a load of cardboard boxes piled on top of each other, because that's got the same playful, childlike clown impulse to it. We're not going to high tech or projections, or it's not going to be Miss Saigon that we're producing.
Right.
We have a helicopter in our show, and it's someone with a piece of rubber tubing that they whiz around their head like that, and they make a helicopter noise. And it's every bit as effective as Miss Saigon, but a whole lot cheaper.
Well, that was actually sort of my next question, because in reviewing the video of One Small Step, it did seem like there were elements of clowning in it. So did you find that helpful in putting this together?
Yeah, and the Robin, one of the two actors that's in it, I first met him on the first version of One Small Step. So I've known him, been working with him now for 10, 11 years. And it just so happens that we gel in the same area, and we've gone on and done lots of clown shows together. What he's very, very good at, and Shay, who's in the show as well, is putting himself on stage. And you see him, you see Robin walk on, and there he is. And then from that he can then take on, he can play Neil Armstrong, or he can play Yuri Gagarin, or he does all sorts of famous people that he does a great Walter Cronkite. But underneath that, at the same time, there's also Robin kind of peeping out and saying, "Look at me! I've put some glasses on. I'm Walter Cronkite," or "I put a bucket on my head. I'm Neil Armstrong," or whatever the thing may be, which allows this lightness of touch and this kind of playful commentary on the story. And it also I find it's very, very inclusive of an audience. It's kind of unpretentious. It doesn't separate the actor from the audience in any way. It's a communal act of storytelling that's going on in that sort of show, which is very much how I think it should work.
Well, there's actually a question that I have that I've been struggling with the answer to this, because I have had the good fortune of attending some like major children's festivals, a couple of them in Canada, and there were international festivals, and I don't know how to say this without insulting my audience, but I've always found that the British or Australian shows were so intriguing to watch, because they did sort of use I remember one show, to this day, it was like, gosh, it's got to be like almost 18 years ago. I went to Canada to see International Festival for Families, and it was a show by a British group. It was called Tiernuno. It was
Oh, that's fantastic, isn't it?
Did you see it?
Yeah, they're a Bristol company, Travelling Light. Yeah,
yes, Travelling Light.
Yeah,
to this day, I think about that show and thinking, God, I wish that was touring. I've reached out to them, I don't know how many times, and said, please come to America, because it's an amazing show. But so I guess my question is the creative process different in UK versus the US? Or I spoke to somebody from Australia. They thought it was because there was more support for the artists to sort of just create their work, whereas here it's more of a struggle for artists, so they have to be more commercial. Do you?
Yeah, and there is. I mean, it's disappearing now, sadly, because of funding. But there was always a very strong strand in British work for young people, which came out of educational work. So there was through the 70s and 80s, there was a big theatre and education program, and a lot of money was available for companies to take work into schools. And because of the strange union rules that existed at the time, to get an equity card, you had to have done a certain number of equity contracts. And for a lot of actors, that meant doing theatre and education work. And so you've got extraordinary, and there's the actor Jeremy Irons. So there's somewhere there's footage of Jeremy Irons doing children's theatre, and he was in a children's TV show as well for the same reason. I think that established a non-commercial strand in Britain, and a lot of theatres had specific theatre and education departments that would tour shows out into schools, and that the money for that came from government or Arts Council funding. And it pops up every once in a while in this country again. Some theatres still produce work that goes out into schools. I was lucky enough to be involved with a programme at Bristol Old Vic where it was European money actually that was for a very specific area of the West Country that had been classified as an area of cultural deprivation. And we were able to write a show very specifically for the 24 schools that were involved, which then toured to those schools, which then had a support programme where each of those schools had 7 weeks worth of workshops, so they generated their own material. We then did a second year where we toured a second show in response to their show, and then a third year again, where I went and worked as a writer with those schools, and they wrote shows which then were performed by professional actors. So there was this feedback and conversation going between the professional artists and the schools and the funding bodies and the theatre. And I think that generates a sort of seriousness amongst British theatre makers who want to make work for young audiences. And it's still slightly looked down on, but there's a growing sector in certainly in Britain and probably elsewhere of people who've chosen to work for young people, and it's not that they're doing it because they can't get a job anywhere else, or they're not good enough to be in the West End, or whatever the criticism might be. It's people who actually want to make work for young people, and interestingly, the best of our current adult work, I think, is coming from people who learned their craft and still make theatre for young audiences. So Sally Cookson, who recently did Monster Calls, which has gone into West End, and she did Jane Eyre, which was at the National Theatre. Those shows are made in exactly the same way that she makes shows for young audiences. They've got the same playfulness, the same kind of open creativity, the same devised nature. The shows that are made in the rehearsal room rather than by a writer. And similarly, Knee High, they're working in the same ways that you would work with young people. And I think that's probably the strength of the British work. It comes from that, I think. That's my speculation anyway.
I'm sure I could ask 10 different people and they would have 10 different answers. But we're running out of time, but I just want to go back to One Small Step, which is Saturday, November 2nd. We have 2 performances. What is your hope that people walk away with when they come see it? Is there's a message that you want to impart?
Yeah, well, a number of things. I would like, I'm very interested in science and history, and I would love for people who don't know that much about that period to have it's an introduction to the space race and the extraordinary things that human beings achieved in that period. The bigger message is that John F. Kennedy says, "No, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard." And I think that's choice. NASA and the American people made a decision to do something that was difficult rather than something that was easy. And in that extraordinary speech, he says, "No, we don't even know how we're going to do it, but we are going to do it by the end of the decade." And he admits that there are things that haven't even been invented yet, that they're going to have to invent. And that's, I think, one of the things that human beings do so well is have a vision and the imagination and the intellectual and faculties, but also the teamwork and collaboration to bring about seemingly impossible things. And at a time when there are many things about this world that seem to be threatening us, and that idea that with teamwork we can do this, and with the imagination and the will to do something that seems impossible. That's the kind of bigger message. But then also, I would love people to come away and want to put a cardboard box on their head and be an astronaut, or I would love someone to pick up a cucumber and say, "Hey, this looks like a rocket," or to see the world in that kind of childlike way again. I think is that in itself is a joy.
That's brilliant. Fingers crossed that that happens, because we could use more of that.
Thank you.
Well, Toby, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. And again, that's One Small Step on Saturday, November 2nd at 2 and 5. I'm guessing you're not going to be here?
Sadly, no.
Well, we will think good thoughts for you. Thank you so much for your time. Do appreciate it.
Good night.